Mary Ellen Carsley is a scientific and botanical illustrator, as well as an art educator. A former practicing architect, she has illustrated 8 books and numerous articles for national and international journals. Her works have been included in the collections of the National Building Museum and the Library of Congress. She is a member of the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, Maryland Federation of Art, the Art League at the Torpedo Factory, Washington Calligraphers Guild, and the Guild of Bookworkers. We are very excited to have Mary Ellen with us today to teach us how to draw and paint autumn leaves. So over to you, Mary Ellen.
Thank you, Livy. It's great to be here today, and welcome to everyone to my studio. And I'm very excited to work with you today and instruct you on how the basics of watercolor using this season's inspiration, autumn leaves. So I want to share with you my website first, and the reason is this way you'll be able to focus on just being present to making your artwork this morning, and you won't have to worry about taking notes because everything that I tell you today is actually on my website. So you were sent the link to that, but let me share my screen with you so you can see what that looks like. And all of our class material, all of our class information, including our materials list, is here. Some advice on buying art supplies and watercolors, as well as some advice for getting started. And they're pretty much everything that I cover today is on this website with even more detail. We also have how to paint autumn leaves step-by-step right here for you. So make sure that you bookmark this website and you can refer to it later at a later date. And so then you don't have to worry about stopping, taking notes, or doing anything like that. You can just be fully present to what we're doing today. So let's get started. I'm going to change cameras from my and of course, if there's any questions that you have at any time, as Libby said, please put it in the questions chat. I'm going to be stopping from time to time and asking Libby what questions there are from our participants, and I'll address them, and as many of them as I can as time allows. So sit back, relax. I hope you have a little cup of water with you, some paper towel, and a few autumn leaves, and we're going to talk about our materials first. So I'll switch to my camera now so you can see my desktop. So there we go, and let me zoom out a little bit, my desktop, and you have the opportunity to see everything that I have here. The first and most essential is to have a number 2 pencil. Now, the 2H pencil always refers to the hardness of the pencil. The hardness of pencil refers to the ratio of binder to graphite. So the harder the pencil, the more binder it has in it. The softer the pencil, the less. So softer pencils tend to be a lower number, or a B, and H's are harder. So a 2H is not as hard as a 4H, and so on. I like to use a 2H, especially for my demonstrations, because it's a nice light pencil for an underdrawing, and also it's easily erasable, and you're able to see it over our camera here. However, if you want to use a 4H or a harder pencil in your own work, that's perfectly fine. The other sort of staple to my toolkit is the Pink Pearl eraser. I will mention brands sometimes throughout. That's not meant as any kind of specific sort of paid endorsement. These are just the brands that I find work well for an economical price. So the Pink Pearl eraser is sort of the school classic. You'll notice that mine is cut. I often cut it so that I can erase in small or very, very tight areas. Other things that I have here is just a handheld pencil sharpener, and I have a small cup to hold my shavings. I have a small ceramic container for my water that I keep off to the side. You'll notice that I use the paper towels that I use. I'm fond of are these what are called shop towels or blue towels, but any paper towel will work just as well. I just find that the shop towels are a little bit more absorbent and they also are a little more durable. You can see my palette. So I have a standard plastic palette, and this palette I've actually filled myself. I bought a blank plastic palette, but you can buy a palette that's already pre-filled with cakes of watercolor. It's all in what you prefer to do. I tend to use Winsor Newton colors, but I do have some specific colors from other brands that I have a personal preference for. And just a note that when you do choose to make your own color palette, it's really important to take a light grit sandpaper, sand that, and then when you put the watercolor in from the tube, that you put it in on top of the little sanded patch that you made. This roughing up of that surface helps the watercolor stick to the palette, so you don't have this kind of situation where they actually slip out of each pan. You'll notice too that I also label, because you really won't, I find, at least for me, I really won't remember the color, and this way I'll remember exactly which violet, which blue, and so on that I have on my palette. Now for brushes, which is often a conundrum for those who are getting started, the first thing you have to remember with your brushes is that when you purchase them, they will come with a little bit of starch inside the brush. So you want to make sure that if you have a brand new brush, that you rinse it thoroughly until it's flexible, and you notice that any water that's coming off of the brush is no longer cloudy. You always want to store your brush, let your brushes dry and store them so that all of the bristles are at a point, okay? So make sure that if you do have brand new brushes, before we get started today, that you give them a nice rinse in the water, and then just wipe off on the rim any excess water, check it to make sure that it looks nice and clear, and then you can gently daub them onto your paper towel that you have handy there. So they're damp, clean, and ready to go. Now you'll notice that the size of the brushes, I have a detailed brush. I tend to use what are called round brushes, although I do have one flat and a bright here. I actually have two different widths. So this one I use for backgrounds. This one I also use for backgrounds, sometimes for larger areas in leaves. I'll mention this again, but generally, the larger the area that you're painting, the larger the brush you want to use. So I have a few of these flat brushes handy. They're good, as I said, for covering large areas and also for doing very, very sharp lines. We'll talk about brush technique as we paint together. So I'll set these aside for a moment. And then these are my rounds. These are really my workhorses that I have of my brushes. And you'll notice I have a number 6, a number 2, and then a fine liner that I have here. I find that these work very, very well for me. Also, a number 8 is handy as well, slightly larger than this one. But generally, you want a small, a medium, and a large. If you don't have exactly these brushes today, don't worry, because I'm going to show you how to make the best use of the brush that you have. For the most part with brushes, it's about technique. So, and we're going to talk about that. And remember, technique is, once you have the knowledge of the technique, the rest is practice, okay? I can't promise that I'm going to make you Michelangelo, but I can promise that you'll paint with more confidence and knowledge at the end of this course than you would have the day before yesterday, okay? So those are our basic materials. I also did mention something that as well. This is something we're not going to be using necessarily today, but it's fun to experiment with. And these are the pencils there are water soluble pencils that are available to you. They come in gray washes as well as colors. They're very, very handy to have, and I encourage you to experiment with them. But for today, what we're going to be using is just regular watercolor, and have that handy. So my pencil's all sharpened up. I'm ready to go. And I'm just going to share one last thing with you. Is a lot of times folks ask me, if I were to buy one book, what should I buy? Well, I would say you'd buy 2 books. These are my 2 favorites. The first one is The Flower Painter's Pocket Palette by Elizabeth Harden. I found that if you're not familiar with mixing colors, that this book is extremely helpful in helping you mix colors. I'm also very, very fond of How to Draw and Paint Wildflowers by Keith West. Keith West was a botanical illustrator with the Missouri Botanic Gardens for many, many years. This is one of the most wonderful and comprehensive how-to books that I have, and I always make sure I keep this on my bookshelf and recommend it highly for beginners' bookshelves. Both books are mentioned on my website, so don't worry again about taking notes. So last but not least is the paper that we're going to be using. Now, if you can use a watercolor block pad, and I'm very, very fond of using postcard pads. Anywhere from 140 pounds to a 90-pound paper is perfectly sufficient for what we're going to be doing today. What I have here is this one is a postcard pad. You will notice that watercolor pads are gum bound on 3 sides. And then if you look carefully, you will find the one side where there's a corner or there's going to be just a little slot where there will be no gum. This is to enable you to remove that watercolor, that completed watercolor. So you use the gum in order to make sure that the paper does not buckle. That's getting the little hills and valleys as you add water to this. So this adds as a kind of stretching, as a kind of stretcher, or acts as a kind of stretcher for the paper while you're working on it. And then when the watercolor is fully dry, then you're able to pick this up and then slide a fingernail, or you'll notice the ends of some of the watercolor brushes have this angled end like that. You can slide that right underneath and pull that piece of paper off really carefully. So the pound designation refers to the thickness of the paper. And as I said, for our purposes and for most purposes, you want to use somewhere between 90 and 140 pounds. Anything greater than that isn't really, is only for like special, for sort of special applications. What I have for us today, this is actually a 90-pound note card. I'm fond, as I said, making postcards and note cards. And so I'm working right on a 90-pound watercolor paper. You will notice that I have it taped down to my board, okay? If you don't have yours taped down, don't worry about it. I'm using painter's tape. We will not be using a full background wash today, so you should be just fine in doing spot painting with your leaves in this circumstance. However, if you are planning on doing a full background or planning on covering the whole piece with your whole note card or your whole piece of paper with leaves, then what I would recommend is that you do tape it down with the painter's tape. Please avoid regular masking tape because the masking tape will grab onto the surface of the paper, and it would be so unfortunate if all your hard work were for naught and it got torn as you removed the paper when it was finished. So let's go ahead and get started. I mentioned that everyone should have some leaves available to them. I went out this morning and gathered some leaves. I have a whole variety of leaves from dogwoods and alders, and I even have some sycamore leaves, as well as some oak leaves. Unfortunately, in my area, we are waiting for the maple splendor. And so we don't really have maples right now, or very many maple leaves right now. And what we're going to do is, what I'm going to recommend is that you have handy right now, you can set your paints just off to the side a little bit, have your leaves handy, and you can look at the different shapes of your leaves. So let's talk about composition a little bit. I'm going to raise my camera up here. I'm going to try to make sure I keep this nice and straight. You have to forgive me. I'm my own cameraman. So there we go. So hopefully there, we're nice and straight now. So I have this variety of leaves. Some of them I chose for color. Some of them I chose for shape, and some for shape and size. So I'm going to take a look at them. And of course, with artistic license, I don't have to paint the leaves the color that they actually are. I can use, so for example, if I like this leaf's color effect, I can take that same color effect and use it on this leaf of this size. But I'm actually quite fond of this leaf, so I think this is going to be one of my bigger leaves. And I have this rectangular, I have a rectangular canvas here that I'm using, okay? And when I refer to canvas, I'm referring to my piece of paper. This is my canvas, and I'm going to decide now how I'm going to lay out my leaves. So let's talk about some rules of composition. With composition, a good composition has a balance between positive and negative space. That's the space that actually the objects take up, and the negative space is the empty space. Also, too, the human eye loves diagonals, and it also is very, very fond of odd numbers. So I'm going to think about using maybe 3 or 5. And I'm also three or 5 objects here. I'm also going to look for some contrast in shape and size. Okay, so maybe not everything being totally different from everything else, but some similarities, but a little bit of variety in there too. Now you'll notice that I've set up this kind of diagonal going on here, and I'm looking at this in portrait. Remember, portrait, we all know this now from using different word processing applications on the computer. Portrait is when my longest line, my longest axis is the vertical axis, and landscape is when my longest axis is in the horizontal direction. So I'm working in portrait for this, and because I feel like it today. There's not really any other reason. I'm also thinking about creating a little bit of a sense of an illusion of space and creating some really interesting negative spaces by maybe having some overlap. So I'm going to play with my leaves a little bit here. Maybe this one's looking a little large. No, I don't know. So I'm gonna look for, as I said, a balance between having similar objects, okay, and different ones. I'm gonna look for opportunities to create some interesting negative spaces. And I also want to create a little sense of movement. So you'll notice that the line of this leaf brings us up to here, and then our eye goes over to here. So we're going diagonally this way, and then diagonally this way to bring us in through the entire canvas. Maybe perhaps a larger leaf here and a little bit of overlap. I'm liking that. Let's keep that. It's a nice, straightforward composition that we have 3 objects, as I said, 3 to 5 objects. And then also, as I mentioned, the human eye loves diagonals, and that movement takes us through. And it's also quite fond of triangles. So you'll notice that we have a little bit of a triangle here with using that side like that. So think I'm going to tip that a little more, make that a little more dramatic. And perhaps maybe the smaller leaves so we have a little more negative space going on. There we go. Now, for those of you who are concerned about having to draw today, you don't need to, because when you take your leaves and also you can trace your leaves directly. Although I encourage everybody to always hone your drawing skills, because drawing really is the basis for all visual arts practice, because it not only does it increase your ability to express yourself visually, but also it hones your eye and really puts you in tune to what you're seeing in the world around you and how you can celebrate that. So with your leaves, one of the things that is helpful in order to make them into little templates is this morning when I collected these leaves, I just put them in a nice piece of paper towel, and I just put them in there, and then I put them under a heavy book for a couple hours, and now they're nice and flat and they're easy to use. So I'm going to keep my leaves right here, and then I'm going to take my number 2 pencil here, my 2H pencil, and I'm going to very carefully trace my leaves. So why don't you join me? And whatever you have come up with is going to be great. So don't fuss too much, and just go ahead and start to gently trace those leaves. I'm going to lift this leaf for a second so you can see how lightly it's going to be. I'm going to bring the camera down so you can see how light my underdrawing line is. So there is the underdrawing. You can barely see it right there. And that you really want to keep your lines very, very light, okay, in order to paint on top of this drawing. Because remember, we want the color to tell the story. If we were working in ink or we were working in a drawing pencil, then we would worry about, or we would be concerned with having very, very nice dark lines. But since we're letting color tell the story, we're going to keep that line work very, very light. Now, there's my leaf. I'm going to try to come down again a little bit so you can see it. Okay, so you'll notice that I've drawn in my stem. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to pay attention to the veining pattern in the leaf. This is actually quite important. And I'm just going to lightly put in the
Mary Ellen, is there any way to get a little bit closer? It's very faint. I mean, which is the point, I'm sure, but it's hard to see. There we go. Thank you.
And actually, Libby, I neglected. I got so into what I was doing. I neglected to ask you if we have any questions, and that'll give everybody a chance to kind of catch up. Do we have any questions in the chat about materials or anything else?
Not currently, but okay. People are excited about the books that you suggested, so I directed them to your website. And then, I think we're just excited to jump in and start working.
Okay, super. Okay, that's good. I think I can see it. Can you see it? That my pencil drawing?
Yes, okay. Very clearly now. Thank you.
Super. Okay. Thank you for your patience with that. I appreciate that. Now, I have this leaf. One of the things I want you to notice is that I've kept the imperfections in the leaf. And I did add this one little point up here. I wanted to add that because that was part of my major diagonal, but I love this area here, down here. And remember, it's really important. It doesn't have to be perfect. As a matter of fact, that's part of what makes, it's that uniqueness that makes things beautiful. I mean, think about that, about especially those of you out there who have a pet. Remember, the thing that often draws us to that special puppy or that special kitten is that unique little patch over the eye, that cute little kink in the tail. And you'll notice too that as I'm putting in those veins, I'm keeping it very light, but I'm paying attention to this one has its veins alternated. And so I'm doing that because that's going to help me when I'm starting to paint, okay, to add as a kind of a reference where I'm painting. So I'm going to set this leaf aside, and I'm going to move my camera up a little bit so you can see where I'm going next. And I'm going to use my next leaf here. And as I mentioned, I do want to have a little bit of overlap because I do like those really interesting negative spaces. So this one's actually going to have its stem kind of coming out here. And I did give a little thickness to the stem. I'm going to go back and add that because we don't want it to be just this little skinny line. This one, oh, do we have it? Oh, this one has a funny little curl. We're going to keep that.
So Mary Ellen, we can't quite see the top of the leaf anymore in frame.
Pull that down.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to keep that. Oh, and look at this. This is lovely. Look at this color transition in here. I could hardly wait to get to that. That's going to be so much fun to capture. And then bring this over here. Oh, and then there we go. We're going to have it now. You'll notice that I've overshot a little there. I think I'm going to have this one. You have to make a decision about which one's going to be overlapping which. I think I'm going to do it this way. I thought at first I might do it the other way, but I think this one. And I'm going to use a little artistic license here. That leaf, that stem is very, very straight. I think it might be interesting if I twist it a little earlier.
So now we can't see the stem. Sorry.
So that's okay. Came down here. I twisted it. It was originally coming all the way down to here. Decided that wasn't what I really wanted for my composition. So I think I'm going to keep that, turn that a little bit. Now I'm going to come back up here and I'm going to put in that veining pattern again. Working very lightly. I know resist the temptation to go dark. I know we all want to rush to it being finished, but take the time to really observe, that again, that individual beauty of the leaf and capturing that vein pattern. Take notice about for your leaf, are the veins darker than the background or are they lighter than the background? Start to pay attention to any kind of special little spots, places where there's some extra branching that happens. It's a wonderfully meditative process. We live in a society that everything here, now, faster, more. And the great thing about drawing is nobody's come up with a way to really speed it up. You just have to be present to the object and just take the time. Just breathe as you do that. So much fun. Okay, love that. So here's our two. Okay, gonna set our leaves aside, these two leaves aside. Okay. And then I'm gonna work on this top leaf here. I think, it's funny, as you draw, a lot of times things end up becoming different and you get different ideas. Now this, I'm in love with the hole in this leaf. And I love these little ridged edges. really makes it interesting. Gonna try to get that all the way up to that delicate tip. And now coming around to do the other side. Now, if you find holding the leaf and getting kind of those little ridges and things to be somewhat tedious, then just go ahead and quickly draw the elliptical shape of the leaf, and then you can come back and add those details. I'm making sure I put those little holes in. That's really going to add something to my leaf, and it has this, love this little curve there.
So Mary Ellen, if you could tilt down slightly so we can see the bottom. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you for keeping me on track here. Okay, so there we go. Now I'm gonna, let me see if I can get the whole leaf in there. There we go. And now I'm gonna put in that vein, main one there. It thins out. And this one there, slightly, just ever so slightly alternating, paying attention to the angle as well. And you shouldn't feel like you're cheating if you're tracing. Don't be beating yourself up and saying, oh, but I didn't really draw it. It didn't really count. Don't do that. When you trace something, you're actually giving yourself the opportunity to really, really practice understanding proportion and measurement. So, I'm sure as you were drawing, you were like, I didn't really realize it was quite that long or quite that wide, or maybe it was shorter than I thought. So keep that in mind. All of these things, when you do it mindfully, you really do get a sense of more of a sense of proportion. So hopefully you've drawn at least 3 leaves. Okay, I know I went a little fast there. What I'm gonna do? I'm gonna take a moment here. There's a little tear in this leaf, and I'm actually gonna get that little tear in that drawing. I like that. Again, that's one of those beautiful things that make it special. So there are my leaves. So I have them handy. Okay. And I'm going to pull out just a little bit. Okay. So you can see. So this is lovely. So now I'm going to set aside my pencil and my eraser, and I'm going to put those off to the side. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to even set my drawing a little bit off to the side, and I'm going to bring my palette in. And I'm going to have my leaves. This is the fun part. You get to play with color. Now, you're going to notice that my palette is a little bit messy. So my husband is also an artist, and this is something that we have agreed to disagree upon, okay, that I keep a messy palette. But I actually look at it as it's kind of note-taking for me. I remember what green went with what and what brown and so on and so forth. But I'm gonna, for our purposes today, this is a major event. I'm gonna make a clean spot on my palette. This is just for all of you today. It doesn't happen very often. I make a clean spot, but so we can get started. What we're gonna do is we're going to play with color. How fun is that? And I'm going to take your medium-sized brush here. Okay, you don't need your flat brushes right now. We're going to get to what you would use these for. And you're going to keep the detailed brushes. You can keep those off to the side. Keep them handy. We'll be using them soon. And now one of the things that you're going to notice about all of our leaves, okay, is that they have a very similar undercolor to them, okay? It's a very warm earth yellow, okay? Just a little touch of some red in there. So I'm going to keep them handy, and I'm going to start out so I can actually do some color matching. This is even more fun than tracing leaves, I think. So I'm going to start out. I have a nice, this is a cadmium yellow. Now you're going to notice that this is a very, what I refer to as a candy color. It looks like a Jolly Rancher, or, a Now and Later, whatever kind of hard candy you could think of. I'm going to mix up, I'm just dipping my brush directly into the paint, okay? And then just adding the water, adding a little bit of water so I have a nice puddle of paint there. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add something called raw sienna. Raw sienna is going to make this, it's going to take the candy out of the color. Notice it's a nice, warm, very, very warm yellow now. It's a lovely color. Okay, and look at that. I'm getting very close. Okay.
Mary Ellen, as you're working, somebody asked if using Sakura Koi watercolors, the hard little watercolor squares, is all right for this?
This is perfect. Those are perfect for this. Anything you've got is great. So I'm going to add a little bit of now I have this is called this one's a tongue twister. It's a quinacridone, cradone red, okay? But any bright red will do, okay? And just like for the raw sienna, really any light brown, let me clean that off so you can see that color without the yellow contaminating it.
And Mary Ellen, you're not cleaning your brush in between the different color choices? You're just...
Oh, yes. I am cleaning my brush between my color choices so that I should. I should more than I do, because I am contaminating my mother, the mother pigment supply, and that's not necessarily a very good thing to do. But yes, it's better if you do clean your brush between each one. As I said, sometimes I apologize. This is a little bit of a do as I say and not as I do. As I mentioned, my husband scolds me for keeping a messy palette. So you will notice that I'm starting to get all of those nice bright colors in there. And oh, look at that. And I've also, I have a kind of scale where the red goes to all the way to a pure yellow. Now I'm being very deliberate about cleaning my brush off. I tell my students to clean their brush all the time, and then I don't do it. Bad me. Okay, so hopefully you have a little supply here of this. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back over. I'm going to set my water off to the side there. And I might actually even turn my palette so I have it handy. All right. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down very, very close to my first leaf here. And I'm going to put in that first layer. My brush is wet, and I'm going to dip into that most yellow that I mixed, that nice earthy yellow. And I'm going to use that. You'll notice that I'm painting mostly with the side of my brush, but I'm using the tip to bring it up to that edge and into any little tight spots that I have. Now, once I've done that and I've laid some pigment down there, one of the things that I'm going to try to do is using the water and the brush, I'm going to try to push that pigment into some areas of...
Mary Ellen, we can't see the bottom of that leaf. Thank you.
I'm going to push that into some areas of concentration so that I get some of the values, the intensity changes. Now, I will tell you, I am noticing as I glance up at the screen, you're going to have to trust me on this one. The color is not as true as I would like it to be. It's looking a lot more lemony on the screen than it is, in fact, on my watercolor paper. So please keep that in mind, that this is a much earthier color than what you may be seeing through the digital magic that's bringing us together today. Now, I'm working very, very lightly, and I'm working somewhat quickly to keep things moving around and to cover this entire piece, this entire leaf. I'm going to do one leaf at a time. Okay. Now, watercolor is what I call a hurry up and wait medium. When you first put it down, you have to kind of hurry up to get a nice even wash. And then you have to wait just a little bit for it to dry. Now I'm way off into this one corner of the leaf, but this has been drying over there. And don't worry about areas when you get areas like this where you're starting to see that maybe a little bloom is happening. We call this bloom, where the pigment is making a line kind of naturally by itself. Remember, we're working on autumn leaves. This is what they do. So I'm going to come in now using my leaf as my guide. I was using that light brown, okay, with some red and some yellow, okay? And if we're going by the mineral colors, I'm using the raw sienna, the cadmium yellow, and the quincadone red. And I'll probably be putting in a little burnt sienna into this as well. But now what I'm going to be doing is adding a little bit of that reddish pigment. Remember this? I added a little orangier. And I'm going to try to get those nice orangey burnt tips. And when I get that edge like that, then I'm going to rinse my brush, daub it just a little onto the paper towel. And now I'm going to come in. I'm going to add just a little bit of water on the edge and see how I'm getting that to bloom just a bit. And that's giving me that lovely effect.
And Mary Ellen, you don't have to wait for the yellow to dry at all before you overlay it with the, okay.
No, as a matter of fact, we want to, in this portion, we definitely want to work wet. This is called working wet into wet. We want to keep working with that leaf and to get all of those lovely edges so that the watercolor's doing the work. Now you're going to notice that different pigments move and bloom with different ease and different amounts of water. Sometimes you're going to need to have a wetter brush, sometimes a drier brush. That has to do with the specific gravity of the actual mineral. I know you didn't think I was going to talk science or math. I know you take an art class and you think, oh goodness, I'm going to be away from that world. But actually, it really is important to understand your basic chemistry and basic physics for this. Because remember, what you're doing is those particles are floating in the water and you're trying to change that concentration around. And like I said, don't worry when little things, I actually like that. That's kind of nice the way that's happening. I'm very fond of that. I'm coming in here, keeping that darker edge. That's what I had there. And I'm going to use my brush again with just water to just let that color go in. Now this is where the real fun starts. I'm going to make sure that the center here is a little bit wet. Okay. And now I'm going to go for that. I'm going to take a little bit of what's called Indian red, and I'm going to mix it with a little bit of a bright red. Look at that. There we go. We're getting very, very close to that color. There we go. And now we're going to, oh, goodness me. Oh, well, that's a happy accident. These things happen. This gives me an opportunity to show you. Don't panic. Get a clean brush, wipe away, and then that's what your paper towel is for. Just dab that off. But just be a little bit careful. We're going to avoid that edge for a few minutes so that we don't get that to bleed in there again. So see, it's not as terrifying as it seems at first. Now I'm going to take this red, and you're going to see I'm going to really come in there and right on those edges, layer that right on top of the orange. Notice that I'm keeping this line a little bit thinner and letting it bleed into the orange. Ooh, that's nice. I'm very happy with that. And I also notice that I have little spots in here where the red occurs. So I think I'm going to bring that down. It's not so much in there, but now I'm going to start to pay attention to where some of those, I can still see very faintly where some of the veins are. And you're going to notice that I'm using those to reference where some of the color is going. And mix a little more red into that. You really want to it's just so much fun because there's a little bit of magic in painting autumn leaves, because when you use this wet into wet technique like this, it's just, you just kind of go literally, I mean, not to sound really corny, but you just kind of go with the flow, I mean, if it doesn't have to look exactly like your leaf, it can, again, this is a whole new creation. So this is really lovely. So whatever is happening with your leaf is what's supposed to be happening. So just love what you've been given, and go with it. And it's starting to look more and more. Now, you're probably thinking, I went to all that trouble to draw those veins, and they're only references? Well, they're actually going to be a little more than that. But we can't do it right now, because that's where we're going to start getting into what's something called dry point, which is when we use the watercolor after it's completely dry, and we use a very, very dry brush. And we're not going to do that quite yet. We're going to have to let this leaf dry some. Now, one of the things that is really wonderful now that this is starting to dry in certain areas, now I can come in with really where these very, very dark areas are. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brown and my red. I'm going to mix up a nice, with a dark brown. Let me pull my palette over a little bit for you to see. I'm going to take a nice dark brown with my red here. You'll notice I sometimes I let it even mix in with, this is my whole palette here that I've been using. And now what I'm going to do is right into some of those wet areas, I'm going to use the tip of my brush. I'm going to come in and I'm just going to put those little spots in and just let them let them be different sizes, little bits here and there. It's very interesting about leaves. There's only 3 chemicals that give leaves their color, and how much color we get each year is largely dependent on the weather and having to do with how much rain we get and what the temperature is. And remember, I told you I really loved those little dark brown tips. This sort of deep red, dark brown, kind of fun. I noticed there's a lot up here, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in. This is quite wet here. It has me a little worried. One of the things you want to remember is if you take your brush, I'm cleaning my brush off thoroughly right now, and I'm wiping it on the paper towel to make sure there's no color in it. I'm taking most of the water out of it because what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay it down right there. And when you do that, you have to remember your brush can add water, but also is an excellent sponge. So if there's an area where you're a little disturbed by, maybe you got a little enthusiastic, or maybe it's the paper is buckling, you can go right in and you can lift out with a brush that has very, very little water in it. You can lift out that color. And maybe even in some areas, you want to soften down some of those edges just a bit. Now, I'm pretty happy with this leaf. I think I'm going to leave it be for right now. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to the leaf that's up here on the top of my palette. And you might say, well, why would I do that? Well, for 2 reasons I'm going to do that. The first reason is this leaf has almost exactly the same colors in it. When you look at my leaves, this one is very, very yellow. Okay, but these 2 have very similar in color. Okay, so I'm going to I have my colors all set up for that. So I'm going to go logically to the next place for it. And the other reason I'm going to do it is you'll notice I have a wet edge right here next to my yellow leaf there. I want that to dry. I don't want to run the risk of having that bloom into the leaf there. I'd like to keep it very distinct. So that's my personal style. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to paint this leaf. Now, this leaf, I'm going to start with that nice, that warm yellow that has just a touch of red in it for my undertone. And I'm going to, as I do my edge, notice that in order to get that little rough edge, I'm just letting the tip of my brush do the work. I'm going to have to use a little bit of care around the holes. I did decide to do that. I wanted to keep those little holes in there. So I'm just going to have to make sure I avoid those. I'm going to bring this in now. Look at that. I've got that nice rough edge. So much fun. And I'm going to make sure I work very carefully to keep that little white spot. Now, there is something else that you could use, and I'm going to there is something called masking fluid. And for those of you who remember rubber cement, it is very, very similar to rubber cement. And it has that kind of thick, sticky quality. And what you can do is you can paint over areas that you want to remain white, or the background color of the paper. And then that way, and then let it dry. And then that way you can paint over it. And I can show you exactly how that works. I have an example on the website, but I also have an example handy right here. And I'm gonna, once I get this one little edge down, I'm gonna turn my, and that's one thing I really want to encourage you to do. Feel free to turn your, I'm trying to make sure I get the, get it right in the camera there. Feel free to turn your canvas. There's no rule that says it has to stay in the same position. The only thing you want to be careful is that you don't tilt it, because of course the watercolor is very fluid, so it will move on you. You can do that sometimes if you want to be really careful and get it like just in the right spot. You can use that. And now I have my nice under painting, that under color, which is what I refer to as the local color. Okay, local color is if I look at something, it's that color. Okay, and so this one's beautiful, sort of peachy color. We're going to get that red layer on top of it, but you can just imagine that yellow color is right underneath there. Let's do that. So you keep painting, but let me pause for just a moment from this painting, and I'm going to show you exactly what I was talking about with the masking fluid. This is another painting I was working on. This is, and I'll pull out so you can see it a little bit bigger. You're going to notice that this painting has a background on it, and you may wonder how I got that background on it. This is the exact same stationery card. It's a Strathmore card, 90-pound watercolor paper. As I said, I'm very, very fond of making these and sending them to people. And so what I have here is a technique that I describe on my website, but I'll just walk you through it for today so that it be something that you might want to experiment with. I proceeded in exactly the same way we did, where I took my leaves and I placed them down and I traced them on here. You'll notice that for this composition, I have 5 leaves, and notice that I have them pointed such that we're kind of going around in a circle and up. So it takes us around the canvas, all of the lines of the leaf, and brings us up and out and kind of draws you back in that way. So there's a nice circular movement, triangles and circles, odd numbers, diagonals moving across the canvas, all good things when we're laying out our subject matter on the watercolor paper. So I traced this with a 2H pencil and then painted over all the leaves with masking fluid, and then painted the green variegated background on top.
Mary Ellen?
Yes.
There's a question here about how you actually apply the masking fluid.
The masking fluid you apply with a paintbrush that you're not very fond of, because as I mentioned, it is just like it's very, very sticky. So you want to get an inexpensive brush or a brush that's past its due. And you may wonder, like, well, how do I know when a brush is past its due? Well, I'm looking for one of my little workhorse brushes. This is a great way to know that your brush is long past due. You'll notice that this brush no longer, it just refuses to go back to being nice and pointed and with all the bristles together. It has kind of it has that dandelion gone to seed look, and that's what that means. Your brush has seen better days and is ready to be used for glue or for masking fluid. And so you just paint the masking fluid on as if you were just painting a solid wash over the top of it. And then it actually, after it dries, I like to wait about 24 hours. You can peel it up with your finger, just rubbing it up, and it curls up into little gummy pieces, and you can take it right off. Now, the other technique that's available to you is also, you can see on here, some of you, if you had a sharp eye, you might have noticed it, that you'll notice that there are some brown dots here. And let me bring this camera down so you can see the brown dots that I have here on here. And this is actually something that I did. This was the very first thing that I did. This is tea staining. And I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can actually see this whole process. So this is, as I said, this is on my website. So don't panic. You can see this. There's a whole bunch of different things that you can do. If you look at this picture, this is the painting that I'm showing you today. This is how it began. I made myself a lovely cup of tea and then took the tea bag and broke it open and took the wet tea grinds or the wet tea leaves, and I just splattered them on top of a dry and but taped down piece of watercolor paper. Then once I did that, you can see what it looks like after I let it dry for about 24 hours. You can still see the underdrawing is there, but now I have these lovely tea stains, which give a beautiful sort of antiqued quality. But of course, for our leaves, you can manipulate where you're putting the tea grounds or the tea leaves, the wet tea leaves, to make stains where you want them to be. Then you can see here in this picture, this is the masking fluid, and I have an old brush here, and you could see it's shiny after you put it on. And then there's what it looks like. You can see it up close, and I just put it right over the tea stains. Don't have to worry about that at all. And then this is what it looks like, just so you know. And again, this is on the website, so don't panic and drop your brush and write this down. It's all there for you to go through at your leisure. And then you can see once I remove all of the masking fluid, then I have this ready to go to paint my leaves. And then we're back to here. And we're all set to go. So this is something else that's available to you that you can give a try. Other things, there are many, many things that you can stain watercolor paper with. You can use coffee grounds. You can use different kinds of teas. And I have some samples, again, available to you on the class site where you can see what kind of stains you get from what. Hibiscus teas. Any tea that has a hibiscus leaf in it will give you a beautiful magenta kind of stain, colored stain. Black teas generally give you a dark brown like this, a kind of sienna or umber brown, and green teas will give you a yellowish green that's a beautiful, beautiful earth tone to use as well. So you can kind of really give your work an individual and very unique look to it. So I'm going to switch back now from this example of the tea staining so that you can, in the meantime, my painting has been drying, okay? And what we're going to do is here, this one's still really quite wet, and that's because of all the layers that we put on it there, but that's okay. And also too, I want you to notice that it is bubbling up a little. Don't panic, okay? If you're not familiar with working with watercolor, don't panic about that. That is normal. That's why you have the binding or the tape. And if you don't have it taped down today, that's okay. Just move on to a different section and let that dry. Okay, and it will definitely calm down in a little bit. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start getting out my detailed brushes. I have this one I'm very, very fond of. This is a 2. I usually use this for most of my detailed work. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a good look at my leaves again, and I'm going to start to think about matching up that color for the veins. Now, it looks like a real burnt umber to me right here. I'm going to bring my palette over again so you can see. So this is a very dark brown. Now you're going to notice there's a difference between umbers and siennas. Okay, so I'm going to take that umber there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to get some burnt sienna and put it right next to it so you can see the difference. Look at the difference between those two. You're going to notice that the umber is a lot cooler. Okay, the sienna has a lot of red in it. So it has a lot more of an iron oxide in that, whereas the burnt umber, much, much less. Okay, and so we get a cooler and generally a darker brown. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to work this center area here, the tip of my brush. And as I said, this is still a little wet, and that's going to be to my advantage because I'm going to create, you're going to notice there's a little bit of a kind of an area where all of these veins meet and kind of start to go off on their own. And I'm going to create a little point of interest here. Not too big, but I'm going to let that bleed out just a little bit. I'm making the sort of beginning track of the veins, of those main veins going out, but I'm not being too explicit right now. And I want to keep that pigment sort of concentrated right back where the stem is there. So we get that sort of pinch point of where all that's going, and then add a little bit of darker. Now, this is really important. What you want to do when you make your stem is, I think it's important to not be too literal with stems. Because remember, when we get very, very detailed, the human eye is drawn to that detail. And the stem really is not the most exciting part of this leaf. So I'm going to add a little point of interest here at the end, kind of like the period at the end of a sentence there. And then I'm just going to, with a wet brush and no pigment, I'm going to pick up some of the watercolor that I've already put out. And I'm just going to let that line move from dark to light to dark. Our eye loves that rhythm. It really does. It loves it, and it follows that pattern. And so this is, I'm gonna make that a little darker at the bottom there. And then I'm going to take my burnt umber here, and I'm going to go super dark for a minute. I'm going to actually add a little bit of French ultramarine to my burnt umber. I'll show you how I'm doing that. Let me move this down just a little. You're going to see what happens when I add a little bit of that blue. Look at that. It gets almost to like a brown black. You really don't need black on your watercolor palette. Black tends to kill colors. So you really can mix very, very dark colors. And now I'm coming back in and I'm reinforcing those little vein patterns. Start to bring them up, and notice I'm using really just the very, very tip of my brush, and I'm letting that line be broken. Okay, I'm not making that a continuous line. I'm dipping my brush in the water now. It's going to fade it out just a little. Might even take a little bit of water out of my brush and come back and pick up a little bit more. And keeping that a very delicate, very broken line. You don't want it to be a solid line. That's a little too literal. You want to make it an interesting little path and let them fade out and let them come back into view. And you can see that really starts bringing the leaf to life. Now, Libby, I keep forgetting, are there any questions in the chat?
Not currently. I think everybody is working hard on their pieces probably and getting excited to see what you're doing. So
okay.
Keep going.
I'm glad. I just don't want to be neglecting anyone. You can't, as wonderful as all of these platforms are, you can't feel the questions. If we're all in the studio together, I can sort of feel your questions as they happen, but unfortunately, can't really do that.
Someone is wondering if you have any tips for keeping the lines really thin.
Using the very, very end of that brush, the very tip of that brush. You really, and then as you dip, I'm going to pause for a second here so you can see, and I'll pull out just a bit. As you dip that brush and you have your cloth handy, I notice that I tend to roll it along the edge of there and then kind of roll it as I go through there, and that keeps that nice sharp tip on that brush like that. And that really, really helps. Now, so now that this is all dry like that and everything, I'm gonna go over here. I'm gonna keep moving around a little bit. Okay. We're gonna let those dry, those veins. And if you're not done, don't worry about it. Okay. I'm gonna switch brushes again because I'm getting this leaf back here. Okay. And I want to warm this up a little bit more. We have to get that beautiful red tone, but I do want you to notice something. There's a method to my madness here. If you look at this leaf really carefully, you're going to notice that there are some areas where the red gets very intense, and it has a kind of these wonderful sort of undulations in the leaf. And there's these pinches right where the veins are that change the color. And then there's also areas where we see a little bit of that yellow shining through. So I want to try to keep that. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to use the tip of this brush to try to keep some of that going on. And remember, you don't be too hard on yourself. Like if it melds together in a certain area, well, don't worry about that. That's fine. And this is going to be a chance for me to add. I really like these these little ragged, rough edges. So I'm going to add a little more pigment to there, and then I'm going to thin that pigment out. You see how I did that? I might even lift a little more of that out. Lift a little bit of that out. So now we have this darker to lighter to darker movement going on. Come up here. I'm going to keep the pigment concentration a little bit higher. Blot my brush just a bit. If it seems like at any point, like there's just, you feel like it might be getting a little out of control, just blot your brush and you can let it soak up a little bit of that paint, and then you can kind of start back into it again. And if you start to lose things, that's okay. Come back. Look at that. Just pull that right out.
Mary Ellen, while you're working on that,
Mm-hmm.
just two quick questions for you about the materials that you're using.
Oh, sure.
So first question, is it hot press or cold press paper?
Oh, great question. So this, in fact, is a cold press paper. So what does that mean? That's so confusing. Paper can be so confusing. So please do not feel like somehow you are completely, not intelligent when it comes to art if you don't understand the whole paper thing. So hot press means that the paper simply was put through hot rollers to smooth out any texture that it had at all during the final bit of the manufacturing process. Cold press means that it went through cold rollers during that process. So it is just like ironing your clothes. If you had a cold iron, it would smooth out some of it, but you would still have some wrinkles in it. And if you have a hot iron, you're going to have a really, really nice, smooth surface to your clothing. So, and paper works exactly the same way. I'm using a cold press paper right now. And I find that works really well for most, botanical subjects, because there's always a little bit of texture involved with it. However, and I'll say that with a caveat, if I were to be doing like something like for a scientific illustration journal, or where I had to have an incredibly accurate and a great deal of detail, I would work on a hot press paper, because I do not want to have to at that point you're kind of fighting the paper, and I really want to have full control over what goes on that page. So it's great to experiment with different papers. The only time there's a watercolor paper called Rough. The only time I ever use that is if I'm ever doing something that's like a conifer, like a shaggy bark on a pine tree, things like that. So the more you understand your medium and your materials, the more you can make that work for you. Now you'll notice I'm going in to get some nice lifting going on. I'm trying to pick out some highlights here and get some variegation.
Miriam, are you using pans or tubes of paint?
I start out, I can even grab it because I have it right here in the drawer. I actually typically use tubes of paint. Okay. However, it depends. Sometimes I do use, particularly for, it's interesting. I've just been doing a series of fish, and I've found that Japanese and Chinese pan watercolors, like those that are made by Sakura, are really, really wonderful colors. And so I've been using them. So it is kind of subject specific. And I don't necessarily have a preference for one above the other. It really depends on what I'm doing. So I would suggest that you experiment with what you like. But if you are happy with working, the convenience of watercolor pans is a little tough to beat. This is a little more high maintenance to work with. So if you really just want great colors and it to be very convenient, then I would say stick with the pan colors. Now, I have a little tip here that I want that there to be a little point of contrast, and I'm going to bring this down so you can see what I'm doing there. You'll notice I just darkened up the orange in the background there just a little bit so that this little yellow tip pops up. I wanted to do that, but I'm not going to fuss with it too much more because everything's very, very wet around there right now. And I don't want my enthusiasm to cause a problem. So I'm gonna let that go. So, but I am gonna take this darker color here that I have and right along where I see some of those wonderful variations. I'm gonna start to, this is like my warm brown that I'm putting in.
So we can only see the leaf right now, Mary Ellen?
Yep.
Okay.
There.
I didn't know if you wanted us to see your palette or not. Okay.
No, coming right back. So I'm bringing that warm brown in there. And I'm going to dip my brush, clean that off, add just a little bit of water at the edges there to soften the edge. And just a little bit of bleeding there.
Mary Ellen, if you don't have the detail brushes that you're using, is there another way to do those sort of smaller detailed lines?
Yes, there is. Well, this brush is not a detail brush. This is my number 6 brush. So a number 6 or number 8, the tip should be plenty. But just since you've asked, if all you had was, if all you had was a flat, let's paint the next leaf with the flat brush. So I'm going to pull out a little. We're going to let this dry. I'm actually really pretty happy with that leaf. We're going to sometimes demonstrate.
Mary Ellen, I just want to let you know we have about 5 minutes left in the workshop.
Oh,
time
okay.
Flies. Yep.
It does. It does. Okay. So let me start. Let me move this down, move my camera up here just a little bit. Okay. Let's do this super fast. I'm going to mix up a nice earth tone yellow, which is going to be the basis for this leaf here. Look at that. Oh, the color gods are smiling upon me today. This is really good. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes you can just, and again, don't feel bad. Sometimes you could struggle and you're like, I just cannot get that color to save my life. So I'm going to paint this with my flat brush so you can see how I would use it. I'm going to start with the edge just like that. And I'm going to use that edge as much as I can. Okay. And I'm going to use the same technique as I did before. I'm kind of coming in at those edges. That sort of creates a little bit of surface tension in the paint. And so it's going to hold the edge there. And then I can paint in to the main area there. We've had some really good questions. Really.
Do you ever use any other tools to take the color or water away, like a Q-tip?
Yes, you can, all's fair. If Q-tips can work, and, I also am really fond of nasty, cheap paper towels that are really crumbly and crunchy. and I'll show you what you can do with them. It's super fun, like the kind you get in the public restroom. I know, it's like, what could possibly be used in there, yeah, other than as a matter of necessity. But no, I'll show you once I paint this. I'm very fond of using paper towels. I also, there are sponges. If you use a sponge, I would recommend getting a natural sponge. And you can use sponges, and you can cut them up to be different sizes and shapes to get different effects with it. You can also create different effects by spraying water or salt. Pigment doesn't like salt; it runs away from it. So you can get different effects. Now, what I do is I take my paper towel and I make sure that I have lots of edges on there. And then I go in and I blot it very carefully. And you can get, and it gives you a nice variegation in the color, that you can just keep it. And if there's something that you didn't like with it, then you can just go right back in and move it around and paint it. I'm going to add this little blush here. It's just so pretty.
As you're doing that, we're coming up almost on time. We have a couple of extra questions here.
Sure.
The first one was related to the smaller leaf at the top. You mentioned create, like, sort of mimicking the undulations, and this person wanted to know what color you were using to do the undulations, if you recall.
Oh, yes. I am using, actually, this is really interesting. I have not been changing from the same colors that I started with. I'm just using a different concentration. So I was using the bright red, which is the quincadone red. And then I was using the cadmium yellow, the raw sienna. And I've been using a little bit of burnt sienna, and also raw umber and burnt umber. So a whole bunch of browns with a candy yellow and a candy red and that's really everything that and I'll pull out a little bit here so you can see. That's really everything that you're looking at. There is nothing else going on there. And I really do find that limiting your palette, there is great strength in limiting your palette. That it not only does it keep things from being less complicated, but it also helps create a sense of a unified look for your work.
And one more question, and then we are just right at time. But why do the paints get grainy? This person is wondering.
Oh, are they grainy on their palette, or if they're grainy on your painting, there's not enough water. You haven't you're not using enough water with it. If they're grainy on your palette, because they've just they might be old and the binder might be coming out of it. And sometimes, and I'm gonna switch my camera back here. There we go. And if they're grainy on your palette, you might have either A, gotten dirt in your palette, or B, they might be very old and they're just drying out now. And so the binder is not melting when the water hits it. And so that might be your problem as well. So this is where we're at today. And so just like I mentioned, you can see how a composition starts to go together completely by using all of this similar all of those similar colors, or the same colors, but in different concentrations for each one. You'll notice too that for compositional reasons, I'm going to keep this leaf quite yellow, and then this one's going to be that beautiful peach color, or the sort of peachy orangey red. And then over here we have this leaf down here with all of the detail in it. And that would actually be the front face of my card, because there's like the fold line is like right there for the card, right across. And that one would be on the back of the card itself. So you can design according to what your use is going to be as well. So any further questions?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Just thank you. Thank you so much. Let me come up here. There we go. Thank you so much for all your time today. I want to thank you, Mary Ellen. This has been an amazing workshop, and thanks to everybody who is joining us for your fantastic questions.